Hello again, class. Once again, we are engaged in a special lecture in lieu of the one missed. Actually, there were two or three. And as I pointed out in our last YouTube production, the purpose is simply to replace those missed lectures. So what I've done then is uploaded this material to the internet so that you'll have access to it. And I regret that it has to be done this way. I look forward to the classes with you. I anticipate them with great joy whenever we can Skype and I can hear from you and we can communicate with one another. I like the one-on-one teaching in that way, and I'm sure you do also. Well, in the absence of that, I suppose this is a fairly good substitute. At least we have an opportunity for me to present some things that I wanted to get to you. And as you will see, today's lecture is called the Replacement Lecture, which is just what it says. It means just that. It's the lecture that replaces the one that was missed for the week of November the 15th. Well, there's also one that will be done for the 17th. This one concerns what was stated in our curriculum as being practical matters, missionary financial support, how to raise funds, and how to handle money. Now, I'm going to pause here for just a moment to tell you some things in private, you might say, are of a very personal nature about this particular subject. I consider it vital. The question of how we go about asking churches to get behind us in our mission work is extremely important. You can't do the Lord's work very effectively without some monetary support. It's a fact of life. It's a necessary thing. Although many of us in our idealism would wish that we could spend all our time in the study, preparing, all our time preaching and teaching and conducting home studies. I wish that world evangelism were that simple a matter. If that all it involved, that would be quite enough, you would think. But there is more to it than that. And I think all of you are old enough and you are mature enough to realize it. You've had enough experience as well this far in your career to know that a lot has to be done in addition to this sort of evangelistic work. In order even to be able to wage warfare, an army has to be supported. That's true in any kind of physical military campaign. An army cannot go into another territory and to invade or even to defend itself against an invader unless it is prepared for it. It has to have rations, has to have ammunition and supplies. Well, the same, of course, is true in a sense in our work in world evangelism. Now, we're not saying that we are engaged in the same kind of effort that an army would be in conquering the world. It isn't militant in that sense, but we are engaged in a similar effort to win over the hearts and minds of many human beings, and it takes money. Now, I wish here at this juncture that our brother Demar were present for this session. Because, as you probably are aware, he is the man. He is the brother most capable of speaking to this point. I have known Brother Demar for many, many years and have respected him highly for his work's sake. He's a sound gospel preacher, a good man, a good person. And he is also a very talented person in many ways. There are many things that he can do well, but one of them that I appreciate the most is his ability to persuade brethren here in the United States, for example, of the need to get behind different mission enterprises. I have never known anyone quite like Brother Elam, who is so good at raising funds. He seems to have a special knack for it that the rest of us do not have, and that, quite frankly, some of us may even slightly envy. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, of course, not seriously, but we do admire him, and he does serve as an inspiration. He knows how to go into different settings and sit down with elderships and lay on the table his plans for work in a given area. He's been to many parts of the world, as you know, and each time he's been able to persuade the brethren to get behind him, financially speaking. And he often raises far more funds than anyone could imagine that he would, because he knows how to make the point. He knows how to get the ideas across to elderships. And that's what it really takes to be a successful missionary. And I'll admit to you that I do not have the same talent, the same experience or ability in that regard. Yes, many times in my career, I have visited congregations. I've gone to other churches. I have spoken with elderships. We've had a number of private meetings together. And I've talked to them about my plans for mission work and the specific areas where I was hoping to work at given times in my life. And I've been fairly successful at convincing many of them, not nearly as many as Brother Elam, but many, to get behind me and to support me in the kind of work that I felt like was important and that needed to be done. But I haven't been as successful as I would like, and it has been to my detriment, because there have been times when I've had to go back into secular employment, and that takes time away from the work of evangelism. There's nothing wrong with secular employment. In fact, in the next brief lecture, I'll talk about that in a practical way for just a few moments. It won't be a very long lecture, but I'll discuss the question of vocational mission work. There is a role for that. There is a place for that. It's very important that we have a number of men and women, for their proper gender roles, of course, they cannot teach over men, to be involved in the Lord's work who are employed gainfully in a secular field. But there have been times I would rather have been full-time in the effort, and could not be, simply because I was having to work with the issue of raising funds. I am not an expert, so I'm not really the best person to be presenting this lecture. And also, I plan to keep this lecture fairly short, for the simple fact that I don't have as much information to offer to you, even of a practical nature as our brother Elam would, for example. And I know there may be times, the Lord willing, for you to be able to talk with him and converse with him in a personal way when he's able to return to your wonderful island. And you can sit down with him and ask him how he does it, especially if you have a particular need and you're trying to raise funds for that work. Now let me go back and, first of all, before I get into some fatherly advice, you might say, some practical kind of advice of some things I've learned, many times the hard way, let's just consider the fact that a preacher, of course, is deserving of support. The Bible amply teaches that. We could go back if we needed to. We could look at the Old Testament and see how, of course, the laborer was worthy of his hire even then. And under the law of Moses, those who worked in the things of the temple, those who were priests, for example, deserved to be supported, and they received their portions, their priestly portions, in order to be able to continue basically full-time with the work of the Lord under that dispensation. Well, that principle is applicable even to the New Covenant. You know how Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, argues for his right, if he were to have elected to use it, to receive remuneration, to receive financial compensation for his work while preaching at Corinth, though he decided to do it in a different way, to support himself or to be supported from others as well. One of the things we could look at, of course, is the record we have of the beginning of the church at Philippi in Acts chapter 16, when Paul went into Europe, and there had established a congregation which continued with him a relationship that lasted for many years, a very good, close, warm, and personal relationship, such that this congregation seemed to have often helped him in his needs. They were very mission-minded. They were very helpful in terms of supporting Paul's mission work. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 5, we have an indication that they were involved in helping Paul, financially speaking, from time to time. The church there at Philippi, they were a very persistent, mission-oriented congregation. They didn't give up. They continued with the work, even though there were times in Paul's ministry when it was difficult, but they didn't quit. They stayed with him. They were a very helpful congregation in that regard. And of course, Philippians 1 and verse 6 also speaks of that matter. And chapter 4, verse 14, well, down to 17, chapter 4, verses 14 to 17 also speaks of the fact that the Philippian congregation helped Paul. And so what we surmise from that is they must have sent him money by a courier or in some manner got it into his hands so that he would be free to do more teaching and preaching without having to continue too much in his field of tent making. Now, there's a lot that could be said in that regard. I had thought at first that I might even just take a whole lecture and go back and, attempt to justify biblically the right of a missionary to receive support. I will share with you this strange anecdote, a very strange anecdote, in a congregation where I labored not many years ago, while I had been with that church for over 17 years as their missionary in residence. I was their missionary, supported by that congregation, as well as others, but they were my sponsoring congregation, and I worked under that eldership. I attended there locally when I was at home, and my family attended there, here in the United States, of course. There was a brother in the congregation who arose to cause some difficulty for me in my work. I'll never quite understand what his motivation was, but there were a few times when he went and spoke to the eldership of that congregation and expressed his doubts about it being scriptural to support me in the work that I was doing. The elders were a little bit confused why this brother wanted to raise that question. Well, he told them he thought that while the local preacher in a given congregation is worthy of remuneration from that congregation, that he can be supported for his preaching there, that he did not think it was right for the congregation to support a missionary to travel to other lands, to travel to other congregations or other fields of labor to work in other places. Well, it was a strange view, and it kind of reminded me of a heresy that had developed in the latter part of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century. Well, one of the movements we label under the broad terms of anti-ism, Somerism, which had said basically that a located preacher is not scriptural. The idea of a preacher being located in one congregation for a very long period of time is not a scriptural arrangement. Of course, that's a silly idea. The Apostle Paul spent at least 18 months in Corinth, and in other places he labored for a long period of time. He therefore was located at least for the months while he was there, and in principle that shows that an extended period of time is acceptable to God for a preacher to remain in one congregation. You may be wondering, well, why would you bring that up? Well, it was an issue that did divide churches at one time. You see, in the beginning of the Restoration movement here in the United States, there were such great men as Alexander Campbell. Now, he was just one among many, but he was a very prominent, well-known man. He had been fortunate to marry a widow woman who was herself independently wealthy. She had inherited money from her first husband, I suppose. I'm not sure of how she acquired her wealth, but she had plenty of wealth. And Alexander Campbell married into wealth, and thus did not have to worry about being supported. He could preach and teach based upon the money that was earned on his plantation, on his ranch, you could say, or farm, large farm, there in what is now West Virginia. This would mean then that the pattern was sort of established for some early pioneer preachers in the Restoration to go about the country being supported by their own means and not depending on support from the churches. And many brethren came to expect that of all preachers, but of course all evangelists have not received the kind of wealth that Campbell received. They have not married into rich families as he did. So, barring that, in the absence of that, we come back to the question of raising support and wondering how it has been an issue. Well, it has been an issue. Some have caused trouble from the anti-point of view, saying that we should not raise funds. There have been others to create some concerns about how the missionary receives his funds, and this is sort of like the anti-approach as well. There have been some to say that a missionary must receive all of the funds that he gets from various congregations directly from those congregations. In other words, the argument they make is those congregations must send their funds directly to the missionary, to his home address, for example. And he alone is responsible for receiving the funds. And they say that in contrast to the approach that says the missionary can receive his funds through a sponsoring congregation, as we use that phrase. In other words, we take one congregation who decides it will support the man in his mission work. It will be responsible for him, providing for his needs as best as it can with the funds that it has, but that congregation will also help this man go out and solicit support from other congregations and other individuals. And that when those other congregations are convinced that they need to support this man in this particular field, then those other congregations, wherever they may be located, can take the funds that they decide to send and can funnel them through the sponsoring congregation, so that the sponsoring congregation is responsible for all accounting of funds. It can literally count the monies that come in and to make reports on the funds that are received. And it can also be the congregation that sees that the man gets his monthly or his regular check from the congregation at whatever intervals they decided upon that the money is to be sent. Well, those are two approaches. Either the man receives the money from various sources directly himself, the man alone, with no intervening sponsoring church as such, or the other arrangement is to have an intervening sponsoring church. And that church is the go-between between the man, the individual preacher or missionary, and the various churches and individuals who support him. Of course, support can come from both congregations and individuals. Many different interested individuals do from time to time contribute. Our brother Demar and some others back in the early 90s, I recall, was caught up in that controversy, and it was not his fault. There were a few brethren who hounded him and pestered him and others like him about the approach of raising monies through a sponsoring congregation. And some even said, well, at one time it's strange. There were some antis who, years gone by, argued that the sponsoring church is not a biblical arrangement, that there's no authority for a sponsoring church, and that therefore all monies should be sent directly to the missionary if congregations want to help that mission work. Now that was an anti-position, and yet brethren quickly pointed out the folly of that viewpoint when they demonstrated that we had the sponsoring church arrangement, as it were. We have something similar to that in the provision of funds for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And you can read a great deal about that in the book of Acts, and there are allusions to that, to the great contribution for the poor saints in Judea, mentioned in various epistles of the New Testament also. So it seems like something like a sponsoring church did exist, and that monies could be received from various sources and go to one individual or one congregation, and that's basically the same principle. But then in the 90s, there were some brethren who took that point of view to an extreme, and they argued that that is the only way to do it. That the only scriptural way to support a missionary is by means of one sponsoring congregation receiving the funds from all these other sources. Neither one of those extremes is correct. Or we should say, both are correct. Let's put it that way. It could be done either way, and either would be scriptural. Since the scriptures give generic authority for a missionary receiving funds, there is generic authority for an evangelist to receive funds and then to go out into the field and to do the work he is assigned to do. And there's nothing that tells us specifically how that is to take place. When free will offerings are made in congregations, when brethren give of their means on the Lord's Day, they're doing that with mission work in view many times. Not only the local work and the local preacher, but they're hoping to be able to help works in other lands by means of the monies they provide. So elders are wise who decide to get involved in mission work in different places and to send whatever monies are available, whatever monies can be raised within the church to other fields of labor. Now, this is the controversy that we have faced throughout the years. But you know, there should be no reason for controversy. It's just that some brethren from time to time decide to create issues when they don't exist. And I think there may be a malignant force behind all of that. And that's our old enemy, a spiritual adversary of mankind who from the very beginning has opposed the work of God. And he finds ways to do so by creating these non-issues and causing us to debate them and to argue them when we should be involved in mission work. We should be involved in evangelism. Now, those are some of the kinds of theoretical issues that are faced when you talk about missionaries raising support. But as I've said in the syllabus, I'd like for us to talk about some practical matters. Now, I am guessing some of you, perhaps not all of you, in the class, may be hoping to do mission work in your home island of the Philippines, but you may go to a field, a city, or a village, or a region of your country where there simply are not many resources there to support you. In other words, that the church may be small and impoverished, and the church where you labor may not have the funds to support you all of its own. And you may need support on your own. So how raise that? Well, I guess one method would be to try to get some of the churches that have more resources within your home country to be involved. There are several hundred congregations, I understand, in the Philippines, as our brother Palacio pointed out in his fine essay that he wrote on that question, and we looked at that recently in a class. And of that number, you would think that a few could gather some funds to and send those funds to a struggling work. Now, I don't know why that could not be done, and I think that it ought to be done. And I believe you would agree that that's the ideal, to strive for. That the churches within the Philippines, the congregations there will all strive to find the resources to be self-sufficient, so as not to depend upon monies from another country. For example, the United States. There's nothing wrong with money coming from the United States. It's not a bad arrangement. The only danger is that if something were to happen to the churches here in this country, if there were to be a general apostasy to sweep through all the churches, if the churches were to be terribly persecuted by our government, for example, and lose their status and lose their property, it may not be possible for churches to continue to support mission work at the same level. And so something could happen here. It's just our brethren in many parts of the world need to realize it is not a good arrangement to be totally dependent upon churches within the United States. And I think everybody can understand that, and you can see why that's wise counsel, to try to be as self-sufficient and self-supporting as you can be, as early as you can be in your work. But now, practically speaking, we know that may not always be the case, and you may need to rely upon help from the United States. Let me give you some pieces of wisdom of some things I've learned the hard way. Number one, when you begin to talk about the work you want to do, and you have an opportunity to make contact with brothers in the States, be sure that you have plenty of information on who those brothers are. Know how to get in touch with them. Find out their addresses. That's the first thing. Find the addresses, email addresses or snail mail addresses, that is, physical mail. Know their names, know what their rank is in the church. If they are elders, for example, or if they are preachers, know who they are. Know where their home congregations are. And try to have some idea of the fields of labor where their home congregations have been involved already. It's helpful to know that. If you can learn where the churches that you're making appeals to have already been working and what their interests have been and their experiences are, that's helpful. So try to know as much as you can about the ones that you are going to make an appeal to. I would say, perhaps even prior to that, get the list. Get the list of names. You can ask others. You can share information with each other. Talk to brethren when they visit your country from the United States and ask them if they know of churches who are looking to do mission work. Because, in fact, there are congregations here who from time to time, when they build up in numbers and have plenty of surplus funds, are looking for ways to use those funds wisely to do the Lord's work. And they are willing to get involved in mission work in other parts of the world. But you have to remember that many appeals are made to them from various sources. Many different individuals will write letters to them, send them emails, or call them on the telephone, or visit them in person, and will ask for their help. So there's quite a bit of, we could say competition, although I hesitate to use the word in that way. Obviously, we are all on the same team. We're all working for the same master, the Lord Jesus Christ. We're not really in competition with each other, literally. But I use that term advisedly. We're talking about now how you, brother, you, my brother, and you, and you, and you can raise funds that you may need. So, first, have a list and know who these people are, know something about them. Secondly, be willing to be specific about yourself. Don't go into too many details as you talk about your life work. You don't have to say what every job you've ever held down was, but the brethren want to know something about you. They want to know if you, for example, used to teach school before you enrolled in Asian Christian University and what subjects you taught and, the experience you may have had doing that. Or if you were an attorney, a lawyer, if you were a policeman, if you did construction work, or if you were a farmer or a merchant. Those kinds of pieces of information are helpful to brethren to get to know you. So come up with what we call a vita. V-I-T-A, a vita. And a vita simply means a short resume or short report about your life's experience, your education and your experience. Something about yourself. You're married with children, where you live, and so on. So have a vita, a good vita, and something about your experience. I guess the third piece of advice I would give is to know precisely what it is you want to accomplish. In other words, it's difficult to raise money, to persuade churches to give you money, if you only have a generic plan of action. If you only can say, Well, I want to do mission work. Brother, would you send me a regular check so that I can do mission work? I want to be an evangelist. Could you send me a check so that I could be supported? Brother, could you do that? Well, it's not very likely you'll get much help that way, because my North American counterparts, my brethren, think in very concrete, precise terms often. Now, that doesn't mean we're precise thinkers compared to others. It just means that often we want to see precisely what it is you have in mind you want to do. So rather than say, I would like to have mission work, and it's not even sufficient to say, I'd like to have money for mission work. That is, it's not even sufficient to say, I would like to have money to work in the Philippines. You need to be more specific than that. You need to say, brothers, here is an opportunity I know about in a given region of our country. Let me tell you something about that region. And then go and do some fact finding. Of course, before you raise funds or attempt to do so, be sure you know your facts. Know something about the population of that area. Know something about the demographics, the ethnicity, the language groups that are represented in that area. Your ability to communicate with them, for example, is very important. You've got to be able to show that to the brethren you hope to persuade. Know how many congregations already exist in the area, and if there is none anywhere close by, that's a very important factor to mention, because it will show here is a critical need, and up until this point that need has not been met. And then you can show to the churches you are making your appeal to, I am prepared to go into this area to try to meet that need, but I'll need your help. Here is specifically what I hope to accomplish. Try to give some long range and some short term objectives. Set forth your goals and objectives. Your long-term objective, of course, would be to establish a congregation, if one is not already there, to establish a viable congregation, one that can exist on its own and be self-supporting and self-sufficient and self-governing within a given period of time. It may not be a few short years. It may be several years, a decade or more. But have some idea of what you want to accomplish there and be as specific as you possibly can be. I know you cannot give every minute detail about what you expect to encounter prior to entering into the work itself, because you simply don't know all of the information yet. It takes experience. Experience is a very good teacher, but it only teaches once you've gained it. You have to actually go out into the field to get the experience. And yet I know, my brethren, when you try to raise money for mission work, be sure that you are as specific as you can be, and put down several precise objectives you hope to accomplish. In a number of years, we hope to have at least 50 members. In X number of years, this is our goal, the Lord willing. This is our goal, our objective, the Lord willing. And then we hope eventually to be able to purchase or to rent a building. Give specifics and talk about how you plan to be involved in the work. What your role will be. Will you be the sole, only preacher in the congregation? Or will someone else work alongside you? Will you have a cohort, a partner who will help you there? Will you be doing the teaching and the song leading and that sort of thing? Know before you begin to write letters or to send emails where you are going, what you hope to accomplish, and of course you need to tell something about your own background, as I mentioned, and what your plans are for your own work, what you specifically hope to do, how you hope to accomplish that. My brethren are impressed with details. They like to know that you have thought it through and that you have a plan of action. When you have a plan, we say, there goes a man with a plan. There goes a man with a plan, and we will be more prone or more likely to help you. My brethren will in general, I'm speaking in general terms now, here in North America, than otherwise, than if you don't have any general or any specific plan. Just a general wish to do mission work is not enough. Furthermore, once you are able to persuade churches to help you, you need to let them know how much money you are going to need, what you think you will need total, the total amount. You need to be very realistic about that, brother. Now, I'm not able to tell you how you go about deciding what is fair and just. That's a decision that you and your brethren will have to make where you are. You know your context so much better than we would here. For example, you know how much the average person who has a comparable kind of career, a comparable kind of career to your work as a missionary, would be able to earn in the field of labor where you're going. Let's just say you're going to one of your many islands of the archipelago, which is the Philippines, and you're going to establish a congregation there, and on that island, a school teacher who works there in the public schools, or even a principal, the headmaster of the school, earns, let's just say, X number of, an X amount of money. An X amount of money, a certain quantity. That would be sort of a general guide, perhaps, for what you should be asking. You're doing work of a comparable nature. You can compare your work to teaching. And you could compare it perhaps to denominational ministers in the area, but that's very tricky because sometimes those denominational churches may pay the man they describe as their pastor an exorbitant amount of money, so much more than the average person would expect you to earn. What is the danger here? There are two big dangers. One, trying to work in a field of labor without adequate support. That's the first danger. If you sell yourself short, if you ask for only a few dollars a month, when in reality you need more than that, you'll need quite a bit more to survive, to sustain a normal lifestyle, maybe to rent a house, to have a motorcycle or a bicycle or even a car if that's feasible where you are. If you don't have enough money to survive, then that's going to be a constant source of problems for you in your mission work. You will be constantly worried about finances and not able to concentrate on the work of evangelism as you should. So having too few funds is not a good situation. The other extreme, earning more money, so much more money than the average person in your community may earn at whatever occupation he or she has, that you are looked upon as a stoolie of the United States. And that's not a very complimentary term. It is slang. We've got to be careful with slang, of course. I know that I'm going to warn you about using slang terms or vernacular words across cultures. But you may be considered as nothing but a hireling. That's a word from the King James Bible. Just hired by the church to do the church's bidding. You're owned, you're bought, you're paid for by the church, and you're out of touch with your community. They will look upon you with jealousy and envy because you're earning so much money, especially if you have a conspicuous lifestyle. If you earn quite a bit of money from the United States, if you're receiving many hundreds of dollars per month, so much more than the average person in the area where you're working earns, and you've bought a big house and you own 2 nice cars and a motorcycle, and you and your family go off on vacations frequently, and you fare sumptuously and eat the best of foods and eat out in the finest of restaurants, it will hurt you because you're not living as the average man lives. And when that happens, you're out of touch with the average person, the very person you're trying to reach in your work. So don't have too little and don't have too much. Try to get by on an average middle class income that is fair for you and your family. Be thinking of the future, thinking of the possibility of saving for difficult times ahead, but also be thinking of your needs for right now. So that's another one of my bullet points of pieces of fatherly advice from a missionary who has seen it from both sides. I've been on the sending end and the receiving end of mission work, and I understand a few things about it from a practical standpoint. So when you attempt to raise funds, be sure you are able to provide specific objectives about what you're doing, where you're going, what your plans are, and so on. Now let me also say, once you are in the field of labor, my brethren here in the United States have sort of a quirk about us. We have kind of an unusual trait or characteristic. We want to receive regular reports. Now I know that because there have been times when I have come up short and I've been negligent and failed to send those reports. And that only harms my work, I'll have to admit. It may be on a weekly basis, which is not likely. That's a lot of time each week to send a weekly report. And I would not recommend that you make such an arrangement with your sponsoring churches or church and supporting congregations. But suppose you send a quarterly report 4 times a year, or even monthly or bi-monthly, however you want to do it, every 2 months. It doesn't have to be a long report, and you don't have to pad it and fill it with all kinds of unnecessary information about my wife and I went to the market today and we repaired our motorcycle yesterday. Just be accurate and say, on the average this month we had a number of people to come to our congregation as visitors. We conducted this many Bible studies. We had these number of baptisms and restorations. Things like that, especially when they can help brethren see what the trends are very helpful. Regular reports, so that they will continue to be reminded of you and your work in a foreign field, so far as they are concerned, a field in another part of the world that they do not see, but only hear about from time to time from your reports. Send regular reports. Let me also give another piece of advice about missionaries and practical matters. Be very careful that you are able to give a full accounting of the funds that you do receive. In other words, if you have several congregations and individuals who are sending you monies each month or on a regular basis, be sure that you are able to list who those people are and who those congregations are and know what the amount is, and be able to provide that list, the same list, for all of those who are financially involved, to all of the sponsoring congregations, or rather, I should say supporting congregations. Technically, you would normally have one sponsoring congregation, but to all the supporting congregations. Be sure that you're able to tell them how much you are receiving. Now, why does that matter? Well, in the United States, there have been times when congregations have supported men abroad in other countries. And the men would say something like, let me just give an example, just an example I'm making up off the top of my head. I need $350 a month to work here in this part of India. $350 a month. Now, this may be some time ago, but that would have been sufficient maybe. I need $350 a month, and with that amount, I can do a good work here. So a church sends $350 a month. But they write the same letter to several churches. And they're getting $350 not just from the one sponsoring church, but from another congregation in another state, another congregation there in a different city, in a different place. And those congregations are not aware of the fact that they are all sending the same amount. So rather than just getting $350, he may be getting $350, let's just say times 10, $3,500 a month. Quite a bit more than they expected him to be receiving. And he hasn't been quite honest. He's been sort of dishonest. In fact, quite dishonest with the brethren. Be truthful and be honest in your reporting of how much you receive. And this way, brothers won't feel like they've been burned. That's a favorite expression that elders have used in my country when they consider mission work. They will say, we were burned. A brother deceived us, and we didn't know that he was already receiving money from other sources. So don't let the brethren feel like they are being burned. Make sure everything is done honestly, openly, and that all is accounted for. Well, there are many other things I could say. I might mention one other. But before I do that, let me say, these are just a few pieces of advice of some things I've learned. And I'm sure nothing that I've said is new. In fact, all of this may be old to you. It may be so old you're bored. And I apologize if it is. But I intended to do this before I even began this course. When I was preparing for teaching this class in Introduction to World Missions, I thought I need to talk to the brothers there about some practical matters concerning raising funds. Because I've learned some things the hard way. And yet there are many things I still do not know. Now, I said there's one other piece of practical information I want to give you. Be careful about exchanging money into your local currency. Be sure that you are honest about that. Let me tell you a simple story that happened many years ago. It was a very sad one. My first mission trip out of the country was to Honduras in Central America. Honduras, or Honduras, we say in American English. And while on that trip, I sat down with a brother who took me with him along on the trip. He had been there many times, to a school of preaching in in that part of the world. And they had to call in a brother and confront him for an indiscretion on his part, a very big indiscretion. That brother had received money from the United States, and his task was to take those U.S. dollars and go to the bank and to exchange them for the local currency. Honduras uses the lempira. That's their local currency, the lempira. He was to change dollars into lempiras. Well, rather than go to the bank, he went to some of the hawks and the hucksters who you find in airports and at bus stops along the street corners, who would exchange money on the black market for a better rate than the banks were giving. And he exchanged those dollars for lempiras at a higher rate than he told the brethren. So he came back and he gave the money at the bank rate. In other words, the lempiras that he gave to the mission work were only the amount he would have received had he gone to the bank. But he thought he was very intelligent, and rather than going to the bank, he went to the black market. And the extra money he received on the black market from that exchange rate, he pocketed in his own pockets. He kept to himself. And the church did not benefit from that better rate. Well, there are 2 or 3 things wrong with that. One, you could make this argument, Christians need to be very careful about going out onto the black market. I'm not going to say I haven't done it until I realize that it's dangerous and it's not advisable. Sometimes you don't know what the black market is. You may think you're dealing with a legitimate change agent. Change agent in the sense of one who exchanges funds. But he may not be licensed to do so, but you don't know that. You just assume he is approved by his government to exchange money. So sometimes there's a gray area there when you don't know. But be careful about going out onto the street corners and exchanging monies there. If it's an illegal activity, you don't want to be arrested along with the exchanger for something like that. It would hurt the church and hurt the church's reputation. You don't want to get arrested for exchanging money on the black market. Then the other problem with what this brother did was he had not told the truth about the rate he got. He received more money from the exchange of U.S. dollars than he told the brethren to begin with, and he did not share that money. The third thing, he was selfish, and he kept the difference in his own pocket. He tried to benefit personally from that exchange, when his only task was to exchange money. And that was all he was commissioned to do. Now, I say all those things to say be careful in your country. I'm not sure of your arrangement, how it works. But make sure when you receive monies from the United States, if those funds come to you in the form of U.S. dollars, that you exchange them in a legitimate way and that you are honest about what the exchange rate is, so that all will know. Well, now, there are many things more to say. I'm going to try to keep this lecture as short as possible. It's been kind of long already. But those are just sort of scattered ideas I presented you about mission work and the practical matter of fundraising. I'm not a good fundraiser, so I'm the least one in the entire school, the least qualified to talk about this subject. But it is in the syllabus. We do need to talk about it, and so I suppose I will have to do for this matter. Thank you, brothers. God bless you, and I will see you for another lecture.